Welcome, wild ones and witches. This week's episode is a little bit different. This is going to follow the story of a woman called Julian Cox. Julian Cox was one of the last people in Somerset to be convicted of witchcraft in 1663. So we're going to see the hall where Julian Cox was sentenced. That's now in the Museum of Somerset, whereas back then that would have been as part of the assizes. It was the great hall where the judge would preside over your future. As I delved into Julian's story, I found that we had a few things in common. So Julian was living in Frome at the time that she was accused of witchcraft. She was accused of bewitching a maidservant and either making the maidservant severely ill or potentially making the maidservant die. I haven't been able to determine whether the maidservant definitely did pass away or not, but certainly she was definitely accused of making the maidservant very, very ill. She was also found to have a familiar. It's not really a laughing matter, but it just sounds so preposterous, doesn't it? But she was accused of having a hideous toad. There's a newspaper clipping that I found, which I'll include in this video, of her smoking tobacco with a neighbour with this large hideous toad between the legs of the neighbour, and that was allegedly her spirit animal, her familiar. When she was tried, the judge wanted her to recite the Lord's Prayer, and she stuttered, and so she was found guilty. As I'm walking, I'm so aware of what a big room this is, and it's so modern now. You have no idea all the people that have been sentenced in this room. This is also the place where the bloody assizes took place, which is separate to witchcraft history. There's not a lot of witchcraft history here, or not that's spoken about that I can tell. Like now it's a place to come for a day trip, which is wonderful, but you know, if I think back to 1663, how it would have felt to have been in this daunting huge room in front of a judge as a 70-year-old woman, it's quite alarming. It is of interest to note that when I arrived at the museum, I spoke to some staff and they seemed to be unaware of the connection to the witchcraft trials. I was even told by one person that they didn't take place here. So of course I went online whilst I was there to check the newspaper clipping for accuracy, and it does clearly state that Julian's trial was held at the assizes in Taunton, which would have been this location. And I wondered if it was the combination of the infamy of this location and the bloody assizes, as well as possibly society's feelings still about non-Christian beliefs and associations with books such as the Malleus Maleficarum or the Hammer of Witches, that possibly could encourage these events to be somewhat brushed under the carpet still. Or it could simply be that as Julian's trial was one of only two, I believe, to be reported to be held at Taunton Assizes, that perhaps this grisly history has been minimised from view. But this is just my opinion, and I really don't know the reasoning for why not very many people seem to be aware that there were witchcraft trials held here. As I looked out of the windows onto the street that I freely have access to, I thought of how much Julian must have longed for her right to freedom and how scared she must have been. Instead, 3 days after her sentencing, and despite her self-advocacy of her own innocence right up until the end, she was hanged in Taunton 3 days after her conviction. Another alleged witch was dead. Before I left the museum, I was very kindly shown around by very helpful volunteers and staff to other exhibits which had a connection to witchcraft and folk magic. I thought you may like to see this very large cauldron from around 1350, which is considered the oldest English cauldron in existence. It was most likely used for cooking, but hey, who knows, maybe there is some magic connected to it. Somerset Museum also has the largest exhibition of English cauldrons and skillets in existence. I was also very helpfully guided to a collection of charms. I had an idea by looking at some of them as to what they were for, but see what you think and let me know in the comments. Thank you to the Museum of Somerset for their hospitality and openness to my pagan life and interest in all things of a witchy nature. Hello. Now, as you could probably tell by the look of me, if you've watched my other videos, I was looking decidedly pale in my vlog. So by the time I'd come home, I was really feeling that cold upon me. And I had this urge to make myself a little brew to try and ease the bugs and the germs. So my little concoction was very intuitive, and I used chamomile, juniper berries, some rosemary, and I also added quite a lot of ginger. It's quite fiery, and lots of water to hydrate me before I settled down to a tea and a chat with you. Welcome, wild ones and witches. Ziggy's going to help us with this part of the video. So I've just come back from the Museum of Somerset, uncovering the story of Julian Cox, and I just feel so lucky to be home. I'm not feeling 100% today. I think I've got a little bit of a cold coming. I've just made the most wonderful tea to help with my health, and then I was greeted by this one. But on the way home, something happened to me that just felt really meaningful, and I'm just going to share that story as well, if you don't mind. So I was walking home and it started to rain, and I met a woman who was without a home, and she was on the street with a sign saying that she was hungry and needed food. And sometimes I stop and sometimes I don't stop, if I'm honest with you, and sometimes there can be a risk to stop. But in this case, I felt really drawn to this woman, and I felt compelled to speak to her. And I was near a cafe, so I went and got her some food, and I asked her, you know, what she would like, and she wanted 3 sugars. And I was like, whoa, 3 sugars. And we had a little laugh, and every time I was looking into her eyes, I just it was like I could sense her being, if that makes any sense at all. Like I felt really drawn into her soulful eyes. So I got her some food, and I got her a drink, and the rain started to come down more and more, and I stopped with her it felt to me like she was very much new to the town. And I had a look online to see where the nearest place was that she could go for some help, for some, you know, to clean her clothes and to get some warmth and get some food and get a drink and some kindness. I said to her, you know, have you been to such and such a place or this place? And she said, they shout at me, you know, they shout at me. And I said, okay, you know, they're not kind to you. So I stopped, and I had enough battery power left on my phone to look and to see if the charity I was thinking of was still where it used to be, and it was. So I stopped and I gave her the address, and luckily I had a pencil in my backpack, which I never normally have in my backpack, but because I was filming, I'd taken my backpack with me today. So I found a pencil, and I had a little card. It was one of those stamped things, so when I go to the crystal shop, they stamp it, and then I can get money off my next crystal purchase. So I had that, so I gave her that, and I wrote the address of the place on it, and I repeated over and over again how you get there, because in that moment, you know, I was so aware of my privilege. I was so aware of how privileged I was to have a hood and a coat, to be able to get myself some food, to have a warm drink, to be going home. So I'd been filming all morning, and I was really looking forward to going home, and like I said, I wasn't feeling 100%. And in that moment, all of that sort of vanished, because I was just so aware that I had a home to go to. And I had a phone, and I had a map, and I could find things, and I knew where I was. I knew the location really well, and I felt that she didn't. And I just was so aware of her vulnerability, being a woman who was homeless. And so I just wanted to share that experience. It felt very profound to me, and that woman's energy has just stayed with me for the last hour or so. And I will do like a little, I don't normally do spells for people without asking their permission, but a bit like a prayer, I'm going to do something for her later. But it linked in very closely to the story of Julian Cox, because that was a story of a woman who was on her own as well, and who suffered judgment, and who was alienated from society. And so I just wanted to share that story, and to just relay the message of how important it is when you can, and when you have the privilege to do so, to help somebody who needs help, whether they're male or female, it doesn't matter about gender. It's about helping someone when it's safe for you to do so, to please help them. And that just felt like a very important message from today, and to not judge. And when I looked in her eyes, all I felt was like a kindred spirit. And, you know, but for my own privilege, that could have been me. And at any point, just like the Wheel of Fortune tarot card, we can find ourselves in a really different predicament. You know, we could find ourselves employed, doing really well, successful, our family, roof over our heads, whatever we want, buying ourselves treats and things, and then the next minute our luck can change, our fortune can change, and we can find ourselves needing the generosity of other people. I also feel like at the moment I don't have an abundance of like money, but I felt very aware of how much privilege I still have. And I feel like, obviously I'm not encouraging you to spend your last dollar on someone else, but I guess I'm saying that often when we do give, I feel we do receive. And so even if it is your last pound and you give it to someone else, I feel karmically we often have that in return. And that's not a reason to do something, but I think sometimes when we don't have a lot, we still do, if that makes sense. We can still help somebody. And I just felt very lucky to be greeted by my dogs as well, and to just feel love. And it sounds so silly, but I really wanted to like share loving energy with her. And the best love that I could share was like a cookie with the word love on it. Which just sounds so sad, doesn't it? But I really meant it. You know, I thought if I could just do something loving for this woman today, in some way, I hope that balances out the hatred that she's received recently. So if you can, do something kind for yourself and for someone else today. I hope maybe if you watch this video that you will. Now, we're often told that the witch trials were people who were on the fringes of society, solo females, elderly women, and that was why they were so marginalised, that they were vulnerable to accusation. But actually, what I've discovered is that although that is true, a lot of the people that were accused were men, and a lot of the people that were accused were actually married. In fact, in Scotland, the largest sort of demographic was someone who was married. So I think this just goes to prove that at that time anybody could be accused of witchcraft and anybody could be vulnerable. But I'm sure that if you were somebody who maybe the locals deemed a bit odd or a bit weird, or perhaps, you know, you had land somebody wanted, or if you'd annoyed somebody, if you looked at somebody the wrong way, so perhaps if you had the gifts of being a known healer, you might also be feared because perhaps you might be able to work that skill set in a different way, maybe in a malicious way, to make someone hexed, cursed, or very unwell, or perhaps even to kill them. So of course, although there wasn't social media back in the day, in the 1600s, word of mouth spread in these small towns very easily. Now, Frome to me is a small town. I did grow up there, as I say, but actually it had a population of just over 8,000 people and was considered to be, you know, a thriving market town, mainly selling wool. So at that time, you know, word would spread pretty quickly of Julian's accusation of being a witch, and unfortunately, you know, she would quite easily probably have been brought to trial. So the story of Julian Cox actually isn't that uncommon for that time, and although these are hundreds of years ago, I still feel that these stories are so important, because, you know, this wasn't the persecution of witches, this was the persecution of women. And also there are stories of men also being accused of witchcraft. I think we hear a lot about the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, but there were many witch trials here in the UK as well. And what did it take? Well, it took somebody in power to create a law and public hysteria in order to be able to persecute somebody, try them against a set of kind of identifiers of what a witch would be, and obviously the fear as well, and the judgment. That's really all it took to have these witch trials take place. I actually don't think it's too far-fetched to think that it is possible that laws like this could come back into place one way or another. Perhaps if it's not witchcraft, then it would be something else to prevent the citizen, the individual, from having more power than the state or the monarch. So that clipping depicts a woodcut image of Julian smoking tobacco with her neighbour, with the big monstrous toad between her legs looking at him, which was supposedly her witch's familiar. And really at that time, all it took was an accusation from somebody to be a witness statement, to be evidence. Also at that time, Christianity made people very suspicious of magic. So being able to be a healer, for example, could also potentially make you a threat. Therefore, if you were unable to say something like the Lord's Prayer, that would be deemed evidence of the time of you being a witch. Now, was Julian Cox a witch? But back then the term witch was not sort of a popular or endearing term. It came from the root word of wise. So this sort of term really kind of grew from saying that somebody was a wise man or a wise woman or a wise person, which was really somebody who was able to have an affinity with nature, with animals, was often able to work with herbs for medicinal properties, and perhaps was the local person in the community that someone might go to for help with growing crops, with agricultural abundance, and also with the odd love spell as well. But as time passed and as laws came in which forbade witchcraft and outlawed it and actually made it punishable by death, then that person was at risk of being accused of being a witch, and a witch was somebody who would use those skills for malevolent purposes. At that time, there were also cunning folk, and cunning folk were there to use their magic to be able to protect against witches, but even they were at risk because of their potential for being able to have magical powers. So some cunning folk were also accused of witchcraft, although from what I've read, it does seem that less of them were convicted. So we don't even know if Julian did have an ability to work with herbs or to do healing, or whether she had an affinity with animals. This is just potentially a story that somebody made up. So for example, if somebody called me a witch now, I mean, I think we've taken that word back and we've empowered ourselves with it. But you know, if I was accused of doing something malicious, I could see why, because I do actually work with herbs. I do have an affinity with animals. I am quite an introverted soul, but we don't even know that was the case for Julian. It might just have been the fact that she looked at somebody wrong, or she behaved in a way that somebody didn't like, and then they happened to fall ill and the connection was made. So Julian Cox was not a witch, and may not even have been a wise woman working with herbs and with the ways that we would maybe associate with witchcraft now. She was probably a 70-year-old woman who got accused of something, protested her innocence until her execution, her dying day, and was never believed. I think Julian was a very brave woman, because for 3 days before her execution, she always protested her innocence and she always advocated for herself, something which I imagine was incredibly difficult to do and very daunting. And although the Great Hall, as you will see, is now modernised, it's now part of a museum, when I look at the size of it and I look at the ceilings and I imagine all of the modern furniture and all of the displays removed, it must have been so daunting to stand there within the grounds of that castle, being judged by someone and being told you need to recount the Lord's Prayer to demonstrate your innocence. Being accused of a witch was very much a case of being guilty and having to prove yourself innocent, and it was very hard to do that given the fact that the evidence was so tenuous in the first place. So whilst I was at the museum, I actually bought an amethyst there. And I've already got amethyst, but I kind of did this symbolically. I bought it partly to help the museum and the work that they do, but also because this amethyst had sat in the same room pretty much where Julian Cox, all those hundreds of years ago, was sentenced. And so what I'm going to do is, as it's a very loving crystal, I'm going to use this with some rosemary from my garden, and I'm going to light a candle, and I'm just going to say a blessing in my own mind to Julian for all those years ago, and also for now, for this time that we're in, because I still think that we are at risk of similar persecutions happening now and in the future, and in some parts of the world it's still happening. Usually at the end of my video I ask you to please like and subscribe, but I would really like it if instead of helping me this week, you please paid that energy forward to the next person that you meet who needs your help. Thank you for watching, Wild Ones and Witches, and see you next week for an episode that I have not yet planned, so we shall see what manifests and go with the flow. In the meantime, I made this little piece of music for Julian, hoping to release any trapped energies using vocal sounds and simple instrumentals. I also used rosemary, lavender and rose, and of course the amethyst for this blessing and release ritual, and you might notice a key on top of the amethyst, and this is to symbolise her freedom from persecution. I then chose a card at random from the Goddess Love Oracle deck by Wendy Andrews, and the card that I received was Wildness and Freedom, which was perfect. If you want to, you can use this moment to send loving energy to Julian and also peace out into the world. As always, thank you for supporting this channel. See you next week, and many blessings to you.